In 1988, Stephen Hawking released a book, A Brief History of Time, that went on to sell millions of copies. Now, for the few people who actually read that book, the universe was opened up in wholly unexpected and counterintuitive ways. It turns out that the way we experience basic things like motion and time are highly specific to our lives here in human bodies on planet Earth. Because time and objects, apparently, are both affected by things like gravity. So go to a bigger planet, a bigger object in space, they behave in completely different ways. Go to things like black holes, and they bend and they twist and they warp and they do all sorts of crazy stuff. Go the other way, the subatomic scale, and it turns out that when a particle moves between 2 points, it passes via every possible route and through every possible history. Now, I'm not going to try and explain to you the ins and outs of quantum physics. I wish that I could talk to you today about quirky, counterintuitive science facts, but I'm a sociologist. And the question everybody always asks of sociologists is, how do we change people? By which they mean other people. When they want to change themselves, they go and talk to psychologists and social workers and counsellors. When they think other people are causing the problems, that's when they come to us. I got interested in the issue of time when I was thinking about the particular issue of global environmental change, and I was reflecting on how striking it was that my then 4-year-old child could explain to me the physical properties of the physical dimensions of global environmental change, and yet we grown-ups couldn't get some basic agreement happening as to how we should go about changing what we do in order to address it. There are lots of other ways in which sociologists approach time. So just briefly, sociology is the science of society. We're interested in people, institutions, relationships, power. And most sociological work on time is really focused in on power. If you can control how people spend their time, you control much more than their diaries. You control how they use space, how they access resources, who they interact with. That can happen in a direct, punitive, force-ridden way. It can happen indirectly through economic necessity. It can happen even more indirectly by telling people, and we see this with Indigenous peoples around the world, we tell people that they belong to another time, and then use that to justify the removal of territory and the imposition of controls over where people can and can't move. There's lots of more indirect ways in which time can be affected by power. Imagine if we can just start to influence how people think they should use their time. We no longer have to control where they move and what they do. They can start to self-regulate. Imagine if we can start to influence the way in which people think about the future, their dreams and aspirations, their sense of what's possible and what's not possible. That will take that self-regulation, that indirect control, to another level. As humans, we've created all sorts of instruments and techniques to try and control time. Watches are an obvious... I'm a runner. I intended to come up here and my first thing was going to be to set my stopwatch going. It's going now. I never travel anywhere without a watch, without a stopwatch. I can live without my GPS watch, but not my stopwatch. Long before we had watches, we had money. Money was the original carry-it-in-your-pocket time machine. With money, we can start enacting transactions with people far distant in both time and space. And money, of course, has led to the creation of all sorts of additional financial instruments and institutions that enable us to move through space and through time. We have insurance, which helps us share risks in relation to the future. We have stock exchanges. Here's the New York Stock Exchange, which even looks a little bit like a time machine. And stock exchanges help us to buy bits of companies. We have futures markets that enable us to buy things that haven't even been produced yet. We have all sorts of things. Money helps us reach into the future and bring a bit of the future back into the present. Another really powerful technique we have is science. Science replaced prophecy and divine revelation in relation to the future with systematic observation and hypothesis testing. Science creates a fundamentally different approach to looking at the future and trying to bring that future into the present. We put money and science and all the institutional innovation and technological innovation that they've facilitated together, and we get things like the Industrial Revolution. We get this massive increase in human production and consumption, massive increases in wealth, in food production, in health, in all sorts of things. And millions of people have lives that are in many ways materially much better off. Now, of course, there's still a lot of issues of inequality, which I won't be dealing with today. But the world which we inhabit as a consequence of our ability to reach into time, using money, using science, using all the institutions and technologies that they've enabled, changes our present in really fundamental ways. But we also know that it's changing our future in really fundamental ways. And if we follow the standard scientific method of observing what's happening in the present, observing what's happened in the past, and extrapolating into the future, we know that we're potentially heading into some fairly dark places. How do we approach the future in light of these of suggestions that we're approaching fairly dark places? Well, it's really important to remember that when a way of knowing about the future like science tells us that this is where we could be heading, that's not a prophecy. That's not a prediction. That's a forecast. That's a sign that this is where we could end up if we allow a whole bunch of foundational conditions to remain unchanged. So when we see something like a climate scenario and we think that that's an undesirable future, what we should be doing is looking at that scenario and looking for alternatives. We should be looking at the underlying conditions that will lead us to that place, and we should be looking at what we can change to go somewhere else. Too often, we look at these scenarios and we become like deer caught in the headlights. The scenario about how things could be in 2050 or at the end of the century is so scary that it's hard to look away. It's hard to look at the period between now and 2050 and 2020 and the end of the century and think about how we could do things differently. The fear of that scenario starts to dominate our thinking. The obverse of that, of course, is that many people stick their heads in the sand and refuse to acknowledge that that's where we could be heading. So we end up with this strange situation in which we have scenarios which present a really dystopian view of the future. And the opposite of those dystopias should be realistic, desirable alternatives. But the opposite instead is ignorance. Fear and ignorance. So that brings me back to this question of social change and how do we go about encouraging some sort of social change. There's no silver bullet. There's no easy answer. If you look at the TED website, you'll see there's thousands of experiments in how we can do things a better way. There are so many ways in which we can reconfigure our lives at different scales. So many case studies of what does work in more sustainable production and consumption. Ideas like industrial ecology, ecological modernisation, living architecture, green economics, blue economics. There's even TEDTalks that tell you about what the difference is between green economics and blue economics. The TED platform itself is a wonderful experiment in sharing those ideas. How do we start to scale that up? And scale here is really one of the critical issues. So what I'm going to be suggesting to you today is we need to focus on the big picture stuff, the big picture, long-term, societal and planetary level stuff, and we need to focus on the little picture and the short-term and our own lives and how we bring the future into the present in meaningful ways at that smaller scale. It would be unrealistic to expect at the societal level, the planetary level, for all societies and all communities to buy into a common vision of the future, of the good life, of the kind of society and community in which they would like to live. Diversity, I would hope, will continue to be a key feature of our societies. But it should be possible to agree some basic parameters. And it should be possible to start measuring some of those parameters. I stress measurement here, not because I think everything important can be measured, but because measurement helps to make things visible. At the moment, we tend to measure societal progress in terms of GDP, gross economic activity, as much stuff as we can produce and we can consume, regardless of what it is, and the other social and ecological values that are affected, are all caught up in this gross measure of total activity. Now, I think growth is really important. Millions of people in this world still live in poverty and need meaningful employment and incomes. Millions of people, even in the so-called developed world, are in that situation. We do need growth, but we need a very different kind of growth. Now, I'm not going to go through a long list today of what I think the indicators of meaningful growth ought to be. There are people for that. They're called economists. If I give you a list, you'll forget. What I'm going to give you is a metaphor. And the best metaphor I can think of for the kind of growth that we need is the metaphor of a garden. This is the last garden that I created. I'm not quite sure if created is the right word. Sort of created, developed, owned. Anyway, it was the garden at our place in Canberra, where it's cold in winter and hot in summer. The thing about gardens is that when gardens grow, they don't get bigger. Now, no metaphor's perfect, so don't start talking to me about, well, you might have gone and bought things from off-site, blah, blah, blah. But the thing about gardens is that when gardens grow, they don't get bigger. They get more beautiful. They change. Some plants get bigger, some plants get ripped out. I spent weeks digging out English ivy and wisteria, replacing it with these beautiful ACT native plants. I also managed to grow a set of swings, which I found behind a shed at a friend's house. Bought some new stainless steel bolts to replace the old rusty ones, a few bags of instant concrete, and the kids were away. One of the ways in which the garden grew was by becoming fit for purpose for the people who used it. So when gardens grow, they change, parts mature and die, other parts are renewed, they become more beautiful, they provide unexpected joys, birds and other animals come and visit that you never expected to see, kids go and play in parts of the garden in ways you never imagined. But the garden never gets bigger. We don't sneak out at night and move the boundary fence and crib a little bit of the neighbour's yard. We grow without consuming more. And I think the same principle can be applied to economies. We can find ways of growing our economies in ways which provide the social value, in ways that are more inclusive, particularly of people who don't have enough resources to live the good life now, but in ways which don't move the boundary fence, which don't steal from our neighbours, and which most importantly don't steal from our children. At the micro level, we need to find ways of bringing the future into the present in ways that are joyful and consistent with the routines of day-to-day life. Why joyful? This is not a metaphor, this is just an example. I like to cycle. I ride my bike pretty much most places I go. Now, I don't cycle, I don't commute by bike, and I've never met anyone who commutes by bike because their primary objective is reducing urban congestion or air pollution. Those are arguments that we use to try and get better bike infrastructure, which then makes the experience of commuting by bike safer and more enjoyable. And we know that the major barriers to cycling are the perception of safety and convenience. People ride bikes because they love riding bikes. If you commute by bike, you are guaranteed that every time people see you pulling up at work or at the shops or wherever you're going on your bike, two to three people will tell you that, I should ride my bike, but it's a bit inconvenient. Then when you're out on the bike path or on the road, you'll just run into people who say, man, what a great day to be out on the bike. No one ever pulls up to you on the road and says, wow, I'm really glad that I'm saving the planet today. They say, what a beautiful day. What a great day to be out on my bike. We've got to bring the future into the present in ways that evoke joy. We've also got to bring the future into the present in ways that are consistent with routine. Now, routine. I know we all like to think that deep down we're rock stars and adventurers, people unconstrained by the shackles of routine. But the reality is that routine is what gets us through the day efficiently. In understanding the sociology of time, at a micro scale, routine is the key. Everybody with children knows exactly what I'm talking about. You cannot function, you cannot live without routine. Routine gives you that little bit more space in your brain to actually learn, to interact with other people in a meaningful way, to think about the big picture issues, even to contemplate how you can juggle other parts of your routine. Otherwise, you're left scrambling just worrying about how you can get through breakfast. So routine is critical. If we want to avoid moving towards dark places and we want to evoke social change, we need to get out of this endless cycle of ignorance and fear. We do know that if we keep doing what we're doing, we will head towards some very dark places, but there is nothing inevitable about that journey. We don't live in 2050 and we don't live at the end of the century. We live now. We live with our history and its consequences, and we live with an infinite set of possibilities for the future. And we need to focus on that period and on how we can bring that future into the present in ways that do not evoke fear, but that do evoke joy. Alternatively, we can wait for a crisis. The choice is yours. Thank you.